Hey guys, it's James here from eBassGuitar.com, and if you're looking for 3 tips on how to set up your amplifier, please do check out this film all the way to the end. Hey guys, it's James here from eBassGuitar.com. I'm going to share with you my 3 top tips on how to set your amplifier up so it sounds great on a gig. One of the things I found in my very early days of playing music was that things would sound amazing in the music store or at home, but they just wouldn't sound so good when you got onto a gig. And so I'm going to share with you 3 tips that I use probably every time I use a gig to try and get the best out of my gear. This lesson comes with a big caveat to it. These are just my personal opinions on the subject. Every musician is slightly different, so you will have to work out what works for you. One example of this is I remember doing a gig for a very good friend of mine a few years back, and it was his wedding, and he had all musicians there, and he had one band playing in the first half and one band playing in the second half. I played in the second half, and we shared gear, and so I went in and used someone else's bass rig. And it really just didn't do what I expected. And it was kind of at that point that I learned that gear is such a personal thing. The player who was playing on the first half of the gig was a monster player, really, really so good, nothing but respect. But it's just everybody's setup is a little bit different. So I want to share the 3 tips that I use probably every time I gig. First of all, this is my setup that I probably use on the vast majority of all the gigs. I do have bigger rigs that I can draw on, and actually smaller rigs that I can draw on. But if I'm doing an average bass guitar gig, this is what I use. Here it is. We have an Aguilar Tone Hammer 500, which is just an amazing sounding amplifier, super loud, super versatile, sounds great. And here we have a Mark Bass Traveler 210. I love this little 210, it's great. One of the reasons why I love it is just purely for practicality's sake, that you can walk in with a bass guitar on your back on a gig bag, some cables or your amplifier in its bag, and the amp in one hand. It's light enough to carry, and you can get through the door, you can get from the car to your gig. I do a lot of gigs in central London where you want to do everything in as few journeys as possible. So for me, this one makes a huge difference for day-to-day use. But this stuff, I really appreciate. This is quite high-end gear, but you can use the tips I'm going to show you on pretty much any gear, and it will really help, get the best out of it. The first tip is choose whether you want to put your bass guitar, your amplifier or speaker on the floor or on a chair. My personal preference is to always put the amp up on a chair. The reason I do this is because I find when the amp is on the floor, the sound tends to go straight into the back of my legs unless I'm a real considerable distance away from the amplifier. And so it gets my trousers flapping, which kind of feels really cool, but I tend to lose so much more of the definition. The other part of this is if the amp is on the deck, and you've got to look at what the room is made of, because how the room is constructed is such a major part of this part of the equation here. Is if you've got a room which is largely wood, if you want to say a wooden stage for instance, it essentially can act like another speaker, particularly if it's hollow. So your speaker would just get the floor really resonating with it, and that's a prime example of when you can start to lose definition, because it can be like going from 2 10-inch speakers up to, I don't know, a 30-inch speaker. I'm just making that up, but I guess you can see my point. So that is that. I feel like I can get much more definition and much more mid-range, which for me are the really important frequencies to hear in a bass. You may have heard me say this before, it's all about the mids, and if I get those up on a chair, I tend to find the sound guys prefer it too, because we can turn the amplifier down a little bit, I find, and sometimes need it a lot louder if it's just literally sort of flowing straight through my legs. There is one exception to this rule. If I'm using headphones on a gig or in-ear monitors, so earpieces, which I know some of you guys do use, particularly sort of in the church markets and that kind of thing, I will put it on the floor because that will get the deck moving a little bit, and I'll keep it at a relatively low volume. but that will just fill out the bottom end because my experience of headphones, I love using headphones on gigs. I love the clarity involved in those. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but I really like it. Is that it fills out the bottom end, goes frequencies which headphones just can't reproduce that well. So that is my first tip, is choose whether you want to get the amp on the floor or on a chair. Totally personal choice whether you want to do that one. So tip number 2 is set the amplifier so it makes the room sound good. Okay, might be slightly counterintuitive this one because you've got all these great tonal controls on the amp, but the way I approach it is that I always set the equalization, okay, so your treble, your bass, so it makes the room sound good. So if I've got a bit of a boomy room, I'll cut the bass on the amplifier. I will then use my hands and the controls on the bass to make tweaks from song to song, or if you're a guy which uses pedals, I don't use a huge amount of pedals live, that's where you set your sounds up, okay? So that's where you have your control, you have your master sound, is another way of putting it, on the amplifier, and then you use the rest of the bass to actually control your song to song. So tip number 3 is start with your EQ flat, okay? So, when you go to your amplifier, set it up in the room and literally put everything at 12 o'clock or 0 on your amp. I'm a man of simplicity. I love amps that are simple. Things with like 15 band graphic EQs and lots of compression, all those bells and whistles and effects don't do so much for me. I prefer the simplicity of just a really, really good sounding amplifier, and then make tweaks from there. So many of my students I see come in and they'll have like the bass whacked up to full or something, or some really strange EQing going on. And how amps and speakers sound best is when you do as little as possible to them. So the signal path just literally goes through, okay? That is always how they sound best. Amplifier manufacturers, speaker manufacturers will always try and tune their equipment so it sounds really, really good flat, and then you can make tweaks to the gear using the EQ, as I said, going back to tip number 2, to compensate for the room. But literally, you may just need literally just the tiniest bit of bass. It's very rare that I will take my controls up anywhere, say over, say 2 o'clock, or if I'm cutting, it might go back to 11 o'clock or something like that. But you will never see me turning something up on full because it literally just doesn't sound good. So I guess the major other tip in this is just to really understand the tone controls on your amp and find out how they work. Is it center notching so that 0 is at midday? Is it 0 to 10? Okay, is that how your controls work? And you'll just have to look online, check out your instructions for that, but be really aware and set everything flat. The same goes with your bass. Work out exactly how your bass sounds good as well. So if you've got an active bass, this will tend to be able to turn, you'll be able to add loads of EQ on there, which again can get out of control, like if you turn the bass up there. So understand if your bass is active or passive. If it's active, it'll have a little battery in the back. If it's passive, you can turn everything up full and it should be absolutely fine. But again, you want to check out the tone controls on your amplifier. So those are my 3 kind of killer tips to getting a good sound on a gig. These are literally my personal ones that I've learned kind of after 15 years, possibly slightly counterintuitive, but it's the way that I compensate for a room and get something sounding really good, so you can get gear which sounds in the music shop sounding good and then take it on a gig and have a similar experience. Anyway, that's it for now. If you've enjoyed this lesson, please do like and share this video. Please do comment below. I'd love it if you could share your top tip for setting up your amplifier. What's your favorite way? Do you like it on the floor? Do you like it up on a chair? Do you use 1 speakers? Do you use 2 speakers? So many questions there. I'd love it if you could comment below and let me know your thoughts on that. Once again, I've been James from eBassGuitar.com, and I will see you next time. Cheers for now.